Here is a free lesson from the Photography Masterclass, which includes over 20 additional hours of premium video lessons and access to the exclusive student photography group, which will help you master your camera and take amazing photos.
In this lesson, you'll learn about camera exposure modes. On most modern cameras, these options will appear on a dial on the top, or it may be in the menu options. Not all cameras have these pre-settings, but if you have a camera that does, it's worth knowing what each one does so you can start out. Let's start with auto mode. This mode is actually green on most cameras. When you place your camera on auto, it will do everything for you. By default, your camera will decide what ISO, what shutter, and what f-stop to shoot with. It will also decide if it needs a flash, if your camera has one built in. It's basically the button you need to use if you want to take your camera straight out of the box and start shooting in any situation without thinking about a setting. Using auto is great if you just want a clean overall exposed photograph. However, by using auto mode, you will give up some control over the image. The camera will always expose to where the meter is telling it to, sometimes using a higher ISO or dropping the shutter too low for a good shot. So be very cautious when using auto mode. For this class, we will be shying away from auto as much as we can. You are learning the tools that allow you to control the camera yourself. We will start with the most popular and main exposure modes. PASM are the initials, or it's an acronym, and it corresponds to the letters on the mode dial, or the options for modes in your camera menu. It stands for program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual. Program mode. In this mode, your camera will select the optimal shutter and aperture for you based on the type of metering you have selected. Remember when we talked about metering? In program mode, you can quickly change either shutter or aperture, and the camera will adjust the other settings to expose properly. It's sort of a mix between aperture priority and shutter priority, which we'll talk about next. It's also a really good way to get used to exposure values and how the shutter and aperture affect one each other for optimal exposure. You can really see the triangle that Phil talked about earlier. Let's check out this demo.
So you can see now the camera is in program mode. By looking at the top, we have P selected, and in your menu you can see the little P. And you can see right now our camera is at a 500th of a second at f8. It's getting a nice exposure based on the metering that we've selected. If I cover up the lens, and it thinks the camera then thinks it's very dark, so it just opened up our aperture to a 1.8 and used a 15th of a second to try and compensate for that. So again, when I let go, it'll go back to what we have. Cool thing about program mode is that I can change either the shutter or the aperture, and it will adjust accordingly the other one. So we're not going to be fixed at either one or the other. It's always going to be changing. So let's try changing the shutter down to, let's just say for a 100th, just for fun. See how it adjusted the aperture to 20? That's a pretty closed down aperture to keep that focus. Now adversely, I can go ahead and just change the aperture. Say I want to shoot at a 4. It adjusted the shutter to 2,000th of a second to make up for that 4. So see, after we've taken the photo, it went back to the 500th of a second at f8. So it really only adjusted for that specific photo, and then it will go back to what it thinks is the proper exposure.
Aperture priority. This mode allows you to pick your aperture, and then the camera decides the shutter for the optimal exposure setting. I like this mode when I know exactly what f-stop I want to shoot, and I have no time to select my shutter. For example, if you want a specific depth of field with a specific f-stop, but you don't really care about the shutter speed, you would use this mode. Let's check out this demo and I'll show you how to do it.
So now let's shift our camera over to aperture priority. And on this camera, it's AV. On other cameras, it's AP or just A. So again, in aperture priority, we select the aperture and the camera will select its own shutter. So right now, we're at an f22. And to keep the exposure based on the metering that we have, the camera has selected an 80th of a second. Now I want to shoot with some more things out of focus. So I'm going to make my f-stop, a 2.8, which means I'm going to get more things out of focus in the background. Now the camera selected a 4,000th of a second to keep up with that big open hole and letting all that light in. It wants to make the shutter faster to keep exposure. So this is really great when you want to select the f-stop that you want to shoot in, and everything else is kind of selected for you.
Shutter priority. Shutter priority is the same concept as aperture priority, but you get to pick the shutter. So the user decides what shutter they want to use, and the camera will select the corresponding aperture setting for the right exposure, again, based on your metering. I use this mode a lot when I'm shooting sports, or I want to make sure to freeze something. I'll select a high enough shutter so that the speed is guaranteed to freeze the action. Check out this demo.
So now I've shifted the camera over to shutter priority. On this camera, the dial says TV, which also stands for time value or shutter value. On other cameras, you'll see S or you'll see SP. They're all kind of different, so it depends on what your camera is. So right now, we have our shutter at a 60th of a second, and the camera has thought that shooting at an f/22 would be a great exposure for what we're doing. So now, let's say I'm shooting sports and I want to make sure to freeze the action, or shooting water and I want to freeze the action. I'm going to move my shutter all the way up to 1,000th of a second just to be safe. See how the camera has now selected a 6.3 f-stop just to compensate again for the exposure that we've chosen based on the metering that we're doing. So this works great for selecting the shutter, camera picks the f-stop.
Manual mode. This mode puts everything on the user. The user selects both f-stop and shutter for the exposure, as well as ISO, flash, everything. This gives you complete control over exposure, letting you to decide all the settings. In this, you can use your light meter to decide how you want to expose, or you can pick yourself. Check out this demo.
So I've moved the camera all the way over to manual mode. Now this is the mode that we've been using most of the time in this class and we will continue to use. You pick everything. Everything's manual. You don't let the camera really pick anything other than telling you what is on the light meter. So here I'm going to pick my shutter and pick my aperture. I've selected a shutter of 1/25th, and here on this camera I can use the touch screen to select my f-stop. I'm going to select an f/22, make it really dark, take the picture, and it stays at f/22. When we go back to shooting, I'm going to go back. Because it's too dark, I'm going to shift my f-stop based on the light meter that they're giving me down to an 11 and take a picture. Really, there's no really need for a demo here. Just when you have your camera in manual, know that it's on you to pick your f-stop and your shutter.
For all modes except for manual mode, most cameras have what's called exposure compensation, which we covered in the exposure compensation section. This will allow you to decide if you want your exposure to be over or under what your camera believes is the perfect exposure. Check out this demo of me using exposure compensation.
Since your camera is picking one of the variables in your exposure triangle, you can kind of tell it that you want it to be either a stop above or a stop below, or any stoppage above or below what should be exposure. So let's take this picture right now. Right now we're at 0 exposure compensation. I've decided to shoot in aperture priority. I'm shooting at a 2.8 so I get some stuff out of focus in the background. And the camera has now selected its shutter. It's selected 4,000. Now, we're not going to correct anything, and let's go ahead and take a photo. So that's our photo of William. Now, I'm going to change the exposure compensation by clicking on this little icon, or on other cameras it might be different, but basically I can adjust exposure compensation to tell the camera I want this to be a stop or 2 overexposed. I have it set to 2 stops over. When I take the picture, you can see the camera has now jumped its shutter up to 800th of a second instead of 4,000 because I've told it that I want it to be 2 stops overexposed. This is really great when you're shooting a wedding and you don't want to have to select your exposure. You're shooting an event, you can pick your f-stop, then you have the camera pick the shutter, but then you pick your style of shooting. Sometimes I actually like to shoot 2 stops underexposed so that I really get deeper shadows next to a window or something like that. So see, now I've jumped down to 2 stops underexposed and I can take a picture now. It jumped back up to 4,000 because that's as fast as this camera can go. So let's go ahead and change the aperture to a 5.6. Now you can see 2 stops underexposed has dropped the shutter down to 3200 at an f5.6. Let's go back up to 3 stops overexposed at 5.6. It dropped the shutter all the way down to 100. It's really customizable, and you being able to tell the camera how to expose based on exposure compensation.